the first academic forum at the Social Enterprise Summit. We're very pleased to have an opening remark, a welcoming remark from the chairperson of the Social Enterprise Summit, Ms. Rebecca Choi. Let's give a big applause.
Good morning, professors and guests from different parts of the world. A warm welcome to you on a very early Saturday morning. Thank you so much for coming to the Convention Center during this morning section. Social innovation has clearly gained momentum over the years, driven notably by the growing interest in practice, theory, and policy formulation. It was mainly through global economic and social developments since the turn of this century that the area of social innovation has established itself as a research field. However, social innovation research and practice are still two very fragmented areas with insufficiently connected actors and networks. So while major progress has been made in understanding social innovation trajectories, drivers and barriers, business models and institutions, significant work is still required to position the distinct analytical, conceptual and theoretical contributions required in the classical innovation research. We hope that through this first academic forum, we may come up with an understanding of the social innovation and entrepreneurship research landscape internationally and also in Hong Kong, developing ways to nurture social innovation skills and mindsets for students, interested practitioners, as well as for academics. And most important, we'd like to establish connections and establish collaborations between delegates here and beyond for more social innovation initiatives, both on campus and with different sectors of the society. I believe this is just the beginning of more good things to come to turn our universities into change-maker campuses. We hope to come up with a report on the discussions and perhaps formulate actionable steps which will arise out of this forum. Taking this chance, I'd like to thank Yanto of City University, Calvin and Elsie of Chinese University, who have been developing this forum since its inception over a year ago. So Calvin and Yanto, more work to come. And also to the British Council, Tristan, and Professor Alice Nichols for co-planning this forum together. So without further ado, happy discussion. Bye-bye.
Good morning. So this is the first academic forum in Social Enterprise Summit. We're trying to bring in something interesting and something fresh to all of you guys. I'm Yanto Chandra from City University of Hong Kong, and I will have...
So I'm Tristan Ace, and I lead the British Council's work across East and South Asia in social entrepreneurship.
Yep. So the two of us will be the moderators for today. This is how we're going to do it. In the first part, we're going to do a debate. We're going to bring in a number of interesting, great scholars who are big people in the field. You will hear their names very often. And then after the break, about 15 minutes break, we will come back to do a research sharing, in which we're going to bring another 4 speakers to share what's next in research and social entrepreneurship. Can I have the slides? So these are the speakers. We're going to have 2 teams debating for and against a motion or a topic in which we will talk about very soon. We have Professor Alex Nichols from Oxford University. We have Nora Wang from Polytechnic University. And we have also Professor Simon Teasdale from Glasgow Caledonian University, and last but not least, Professor Zhao Meng from Renmin University, Beijing. So the 2 of us will be the moderators. Okay, to set the scene right, we'll start with a quick review of the definitions of social entrepreneurship. We all know there's so many definitions out there. The folks or scholars from social work will call social entrepreneurship as the use of market principles or the marketization of the social work practices. People from non-profit, for example, also embraces the market principles. Hence, a lot of people is the use of business principles for the non-profit organizations. A common view adopted by people are the management view or the business view, which is the use of business principles to solve social problems, or hybridizing commercial logic and social welfare logic at one go to solve various social problems. But the most confusing one, and which is reflecting the truth of what happens in the field, is the philosophical view, which says like social entrepreneurship is almost like an art. It's difficult to define it, but once you see it, you know it. This is social entrepreneurship. So what is it really, social entrepreneurship, and what we need it, and for what? For what purpose? What can we do out of social entrepreneurship? So these are the kinds of very basic discussions that we are hoping to bring in from today's debate. And how are we going to do the debate? Can we go to the next? This is another definitions: citizen-driven interventions to societal challenges, to pursue pluralistic goals, to create a society that is more just, equal, and sustainable. So there's another definition. Can we go to the next slides? Examples. So let's have a bit of examples. This is the most commonly adopted approach to doing social entrepreneurship, in which people are creating platforms or organizations to create jobs for a lot of people who are disadvantaged or disempowered. Sorry, the previous slide. For example, the big issue, we all know big issue, helping the homeless by selling magazines. Hong Kong's example is Hong Kong's translingual services helping the ethnic minorities to be language interpreters to help other ethnic minorities when they're visiting a doctor. And then we have other types that are more innovative or more creating a systemic change, like Popo, training the rats to sniff landmines, to sniff tuberculosis, which is a much cheaper and cost-effective solutions to a lot of these landmine problems. In Hong Kong, we have Lightbee, a new way of sharing a home using the property owned by kind-hearted landlords and putting 2 or more single-parent families to live together and paying a much lower rent than what they normally pay in subdivided flats. And we have the last type of example, last but not least, the type of social entrepreneurship that's trying to benefit a lot of people. We call them the bottom, the pyramid model. For example, Proximity that started in Myanmar that developed or designs very innovative and low-cost farming equipments and irrigation. So this is one example. They're using solar power to help farmers to do the irrigation. Another example is from India. A lot of people couldn't afford affordable housing, so they're creating what they call it Chototel, which means a $2 hotel per night. So it's a very interesting model. So next. I will pass on to Tristan to chair the debate.
Okay, thank you.
Just following the instructions.
All right. Hold on. So, okay, you can see that I've been given this unenviable task of managing these 4 heavyweight academics over here. I'll start off by just inviting you to come up to the stage. If I can have Alex and Nora on this side, and Simon and Meng on that side of me, to start off with. Please welcome them to the stage. Okay, so in a moment, I'm going to ask you all to vote on the motion. So the motion is social entrepreneurship can solve all social problems. Okay, so have a little think about it and decide whether you are for or against the motion. And in a moment, I'm going to invite you to stand up. Okay, but not yet. And if you are in favor of the motion, I would like you to sit on this side. And if you are against the motion, I would like you to sit on this side, okay? I know how difficult it can be sometimes to get people to move, so I really would like you to be honest and to stand up and move, depending on where you sit on this motion, okay? And at the end, we will ask you again and see whether anybody moves across, so we will see who actually wins the debate. Now, the winning team will not be the team that wins overall, but will be the team that manages to move the most people during the debate. So the question isn't around whether you agree with this or not, it's who can persuade the most people to move across the room, okay? Is that clear? Good. So this side is agree, good. This side is? Okay, well we can move now then.
Lost control already.
So it looks like Nora and Alex have the biggest challenge here. Okay, so just for clarity, then everybody on this side agrees with the motion. We all agree that social entrepreneurship can solve all social problems, whereas on this side, we all disagree with the motion. Okay, fantastic. Good, okay, excellent. So I'll just run you through the rules of the debate. As I told you, this is a very difficult challenge to keep them from sparring with each other. Please wait until... Oh yes, I think you should swap over. Yeah, 4 against. Good, that makes more sense, yeah. Okay. Brilliant. Just one quick question. Mike, are they going to stand up here to, for the debate, or do you want to sit?
Not.
You want to sit here? You're happy sitting
I'm
here?
gonna.
Do it standing because I've written it down on my phone, so I don't mind if it's
Okay.
I'm walking around.
Okay. So you're free to sit, stand, drag people across, whatever you need to do to win. Okay, so the rules of the debate are...
Can we move during the debate? Maybe in the middle we already kind of...
Well, I think we need to be able to visually remember where you are now so we can see more clearly at the end what the results are. So I would urge you to actually wait until the end before moving again. Of course, you can leave to go if you have to, but you're not stuck. Okay, so the rules are each team will get 5 minutes to make their case. So we'll start with Alex, first of all. Then we'll hand over to Meng. We'll hand back to Nora, and we'll conclude with Simon. There will then be an opportunity for some reflections and questions from you guys in the audience. Before we have a final 1 minute argument from either side, from both sides, and you can choose which of you is going to make that final 1 minute case. And then we will vote at the end on the motion. Is that clear?
Well, look
you
at
happy?
me.
Are you guys happy with that?
Sure.
Good. Okay, fantastic. So without further, and I'm going to be very strict with time as well. So I will keep the time here, and I'll show you it so you can keep an eye. Okay, so without further ado, we'll hand over to Alex Nichols to begin the debate.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Good morning, thank you. So, so what a challenge I have. Look at you all. I suspect you're in the wrong room, right? Maybe you should go to a different session. Okay, so I'm delighted to speak in favor of the motion, and I hope I can take some of you with me across the aisle in the next 5 minutes. I want to talk about the 3 Ps of social entrepreneurship and use these 3 Ps to argue in favor of the motion. Now, we face, as you all know, an extraordinary amount of wicked, deep, perhaps irresolvable problems globally, and these seem to be getting worse and worse. And what does that say to us? It says to us that the existing systems are failing. The systems that we thought could organize global governance and could ensure prosperity and safety for the populations of the world are failing us. So we need something different, and social entrepreneurship offers one model of that innovation and difference to try and help us address these terrible problems. So what's the first P? The first P of social entrepreneurship is people. Extraordinary people, maybe some people in the room. People who are our new superheroes, as I like to think of them. So think of Bill Drayton, the founder of Ashoka, dressed up as Spider-Man, rushing in, shooting his web of Ashoka fellows all over the world building connections between social entrepreneurs so they can be more effective. I think of Wendy Kopp, who founded Teach for America and then Teach for All, like Wonder Woman, coming in, dealing with kryptonite in education, sorting out the problems for people who don't have access to good education by bringing on the most talented students into teaching posts in the hardest to reach schools in the US and beyond. Or think of Muhammad Yunus, like Thor with his hammer of microfinance, smashing down inequality and poverty. So we have these superheroes, but of course it's much more than just that. It's, as Ashoka would say, everyone's a change maker. It's the superhero or superheroine in all of us that's pushing this forward. So one of the first arguments, I think, then, for the power of social entrepreneurship to address these many social problems we have in the world are the people. And that's Muhammad Yunus calling in right now. So you're absolutely right, get those people moving across. So I think that's very important. So we have the heroes and heroines who I think have been the pathfinders and the leaders, but they're pushing an agenda to make everybody feel empowered to make changes in their communities and in the bigger societies in which we live. Second P, performance. So social entrepreneurs are obsessed with performance and measuring impact. So this means, in comparison with more conventional models of welfare or delivering social non-market goods, they should be superior. Governments are very bad at measuring impact, if they care at all about it. Charities historically have been poor in this too, and corporations up until recently didn't care about this issue. So, so the performance agenda for social entrepreneurs is driving their innovation, it's driving their relentless attempt to do more for their key beneficiaries and communities. And around that has developed a whole industry now of impact measurement systems, which is yet to clear out, but I think will do. I think in due course we'll have standardized measures of social impact. There's projects underway with UNDP and the Impact Management Project to try to do this, create global standards, and I think eventually these standards will be regulated too by governments. So we'll have regulated accounting and reporting for impact just like we do for financial performance. How am I doing on time? 1 minute. And the third P is politics. So social entrepreneurs think systemically. They think beyond just the charitable sector or just the NGO sector to address big-scale change, big-scale innovation, what I would call social innovation as opposed to social enterprise. Now, to do that, you have to deal with power and politics. And that can mean many different things. It doesn't necessarily have to be about government. It could be about recognizing that the reason many terrible social problems are endemic and unchanged over time is because of political and power structures maintaining and sustaining them. So if you want to get systemic change, you have to get behind the structures of power and politics that drive the problems you want to address. And social entrepreneurs increasingly are recognizing that, and they're working with people across the spectrum, corporates, governments, social movements, to get behind the politics of systemic change. So those 3 Ps then, I think, set out social entrepreneurs as being distinctive and offering us our best hope for addressing the major problems of the world. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I noticed before that a few people joined us, and you sat wherever you sat, but there's a reason why there are so many people on this side and not on this side. So if you just came in during the initial talk, then you need to make a very quick decision. If you are in favor of this motion, can I say it again? So if you're in favor of this motion that social entrepreneurship can solve all social problems, then you have to sit on this side. If you don't agree with it, then go to that side. So if you just came in, then please make your decision very quickly and decide which side you want to be on. Otherwise, you're going to distort our numbers.
Did you have to do that?
Yeah, no, we're going to be very strict here. So if you are in favor and you just came in, then stay where you are on this side. If not, then you have to go over here. Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Alex. Meng, over to you.
Who want to move to that place? Thank you very much. Well, I'm not sure whether I need to argue about anything, actually. So most of the audience are already with us. Yes. And Alex, I think, has a beautiful introduction about some wonderful cases about social entrepreneurship. And obviously, social entrepreneurship has mobilized a lot of support from different sectors. But our argument is social entrepreneurship definitely is not the solution for all social problems, right? Well, when I say social entrepreneurship, we believe it's like you apply entrepreneurship to solve social problems. It can be very innovative, sustainable, but social entrepreneurship is never, I don't know whether practitioners agree with me, is never the whole solution. It's always part of the solution. So it always go along with other factors, never works alone. It's just like business entrepreneurship. It's not the only factor that can explain the success of business ventures. It's the same thing. So there are many other factors. For example, could be institutional environment that encourage overall entrepreneurship innovation. That could be technology. Or could be, don't forget the fundamental role of the large sector of civil society organizations. So even though not many of them have very strong social entrepreneurship, but altogether they are critical to defend social justice, to improve social welfare. So actually today there's a lot of debate in China and in many other emerging markets about whether or not nonprofits have to have a lot of social entrepreneurship, whether you have to have a business model to be very innovative, or civil society organizations can themselves become very fundamental element. They form in the infrastructure of a social development, right? Not individual heroes. Well, on the other hand, we believe social entrepreneurship, if not handled properly, can even cause social problems rather than solving social problems. There are so many business people calling themselves social entrepreneurs, claiming they have strong social entrepreneurship. But when they come to address social problems, they neither will be very committed nor sustainable or innovative. A lot of them do greenwashing, social washing. And social entrepreneurship also share a lot of problems with other business entrepreneurship. For example, as individual founder, they may have some of them may have strong ego-centered leadership. Some of them have agency problem. They may put their self-interest above organizational interest. And we can see chaos management in many social enterprises, right? So even ethical problems, under huge pressure, some social entrepreneurs even dare to cook some numbers. So we've seen a lot of these things happening. Maybe that's one of the reasons many of you want to move to this side. So we know it's very complicated and it has its own challenge. So our point is that it is not the solution, it's always part of the solution. There are many other factors are equally important or even more important. And social entrepreneurship itself might cause social problems, not solving social problems. All right? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, you only needed 3 minutes to make your argument. It's so incredibly impressive. It shows the confidence of your side. Okay, brilliant. So we're going to go back over to this side and to Nora to make your case in favor of the motion.
Okay, so I'm not gonna, give a.
Come over to this side already.
Yeah, I'm not gonna give a long lecture, So what I'm gonna do is just to ask you a few questions. So I want you to ask first question I want to ask is, how many of you actually agree that social entrepreneurship is equal to social enterprise? Please raise your hands. Yeah, social entrepreneurship is equal to social enterprise. Could you please raise your hands if you agree with this agree with this statement? Okay, so can you? Okay, the second question I want to ask is, do you think social entrepreneurship can also be found in public sector? A few. So, do you think social entrepreneurship can also be found in business sector? Do you think social entrepreneurship can also be found in nonprofit sector? Okay, so do you think social entrepreneurship can also be found in civil society? So why are you sitting here? You should be sitting here. So I just mapped all the sectors and the civil society outside the public, private, and the sector. So yes, that's the end of my argument.
Okay, incredibly confident sets of teams. Just 1 minute 34 seconds. Okay, brilliant. Simon, I mean, is it just one word from you, or are you going to take your 5 minutes?
I'm sorry, they've convinced me, so... Right. I'm just a dumb professor of public policy. I'm not nearly as clever as these clever people here. They know all about social entrepreneurship. They've been to Oxford and they've convinced me. I did my research using Google, and I was Googling while Alex was speaking. I Googled the 3 Ps, and do not Google the 3 Ps. You can get into trouble for that. But what I did was, I went and I tried to learn a bit more about social entrepreneurship. Most of this Alex has already covered. He's even pinched my Batman joke. I think he got hold of my slides, but there's 3.47 million definitions of social entrepreneurship. All of them involve people doing nice things. Some common themes are innovative approaches to solving social problems. They create new equilibria, and not just anybody can be a social entrepreneur. It's about heroic individuals. This is where Batman comes in. And they tread boldly where bureaucratic and inefficient governments have messed up. That's me. They can't use technology. I can't even get my phone to turn around. Where charities make a real mess of things, they just stick a sticking plaster on, and we need these social entrepreneurs, and that's why Alex is right. Then I Googled 10 famous social entrepreneurs. You can do it yourself, and it's really interesting. I learnt more about social entrepreneurship. Not just anyone can be a social entrepreneur. You have to be a man to be a famous social entrepreneur. Then they rank the most famous. We've got Muhammad Yunus. I'm going to run out of time, so I'm going to skip through this. And if I get anything wrong, blame Google and not me. So Muhammad Yunus spotted that there was a problem in that poor people didn't owe enough money. So he devised a clever solution that led to them owing more money and eventually led to the 2008 financial crisis. So he solved a social problem. Bill Drayton, if anyone's ever seen a picture of him, I'm not allowed to say that. Right. So Bill Drayton, he saw the social problem that nobody knew what a social entrepreneur was. So he spent billions of pounds telling people what social entrepreneurs are. Blake, I can't pronounce his last name, but he runs Tom's Shoes, and he saw that there's a social problem, there's not enough shoes in the world. So he made a business that sells more shoes. Personally, I think the problem is not that there's too many shoes, not enough shoes in the world. I think shoes aren't fairly distributed. My wife has most of them. Now, these heroic social entrepreneurs, they've all solved the social problems, not necessarily the ones they set out to solve, but they have solved social problems. And do you know how I know this? Who's heard of the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, you can tell me what they are, but there's 17 of them, and if we get all these met, we're on our way to a better world. And I've looked through them, and nowhere does it mention we need to make poor people even poorer. It doesn't mention anything about needing to know more about social entrepreneurship, and it certainly doesn't mention anything about needing more shoes. So that's why Alex is right. Social entrepreneurs have solved the problems of today, and they can solve the problems of tomorrow. Thank you, and move to this side of the room.
Okay, wow. So neither team took their full 5 minutes. I do need to invite the people that came in again, because we can't distort our numbers. So those of you who just came in now, if you are in favor of this motion, then you need to stay where you are. If you don't agree with it, then you need to go and sit over here, and hopefully you can be persuaded one way or the other in the next 15 or so minutes.
Is that a fire? Come to this side of the room.
Okay, so fantastic, thank you very much. So on this side, from Alex and Nora, we heard about the 3 Ps, the people, the performance, and the politics. And we also heard that social entrepreneurship actually can be found in all parts of society. So in that regard, social entrepreneurship can be the savior of, or the solution towards social problems, because in fact, it's social entrepreneurs that are delivering change in government, in business, and in civil society, or the third sector. On this side, we heard that social entrepreneurship is only ever going to be a part of the solution. It's never going to be the whole solution. And we also heard about the risk of overclaiming, greenwashing, and whitewashing, and the egos that you find amongst social entrepreneurs as well. And then I won't even attempt to summarize Simon's final argument about shoes and things like that.
This whole event has been rigged.
Okay. So now is the opportunity for some reflections and questions from the floor. So I'm going to invite you all to either reflect on what you've heard. Maybe you may wish to change or influence people's opinions in the audience, or ask a question of our esteemed panelists here. Okay. So we'll start here. I can pass a microphone out.
Hi, I'm Stephanie from our conservatory, a local impact investment brokerage. This question is for Professor Nichols, actually. Addressing the second P, performance, and a large part of that, of your argument actually relies on data transparency and measurement and accuracy. But we are in the midst of this massive data revolution that has already transformed the private sector, and arguably the social sector is behind. Now, if the data revolution actually proliferates to the public sector, to the social sector, across the private sector, in a more fairly distributed way, do we then still need a tag of social entrepreneurship? Because is data alone already powerful enough to drive the first and third Ps?
I'm going to take a few questions and then come to get reflections from us all. So there's a question from Ruth there as well. And if there's any other questions, we'll take one round, and then we'll take some reflections from everybody, and then...
Ruth Phillips from the University of Sydney. I guess one question I'd like to put, and both of you can respond, is that really big social enterprise or social entrepreneurship tends to be most effective and most widespread in countries where you might describe they have a failed state, and in particular they have a minimal or non-existent welfare state, whereas countries that have strong welfare states don't really have large social entrepreneurs, solving social problems. So I guess I'd like to hear your response to that, given that all is in that motion. How can you really promise to solve social problems if you haven't got an effective welfare state?
Thank you. Any other initial reflections or questions?
To remember all these, can we
I'll summarize them. Philo, over to you. They're all from this side, all sitting next to each other, in fact. I think there's something going on here. So please. Yeah.
Yeah, Philo Alto, Asia Valley Advisors, philanthropy advisory firm. I think the question itself does point, and the debates that have been surfaced on both sides of the camp suggest two approaches to the question, which is one is social entrepreneurship as a tool to address social issues in the world, however you define it, whether through an entity or through an organization or something, or an initiative. The other one is, I think the point that Nora alluded to was social entrepreneurship as an approach or a mindset, in which case the intentionality of social impact is always a positive in terms of creating different ways of approaching social solutions. And I think that duality of discussion is actually important, because I think as we respond to this, let's think about it in terms of unbundling the two. One is intentionality of social impact, in which case whatever you do, however you express it, is actually actionable towards the betterment or addressing social issues. The other one is a tool itself. So I think those are I think if the panelists can unbundle the two in their response would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, one more question here for Marie, and then we'll come back and get some reflections from our two sides.
Thank you. That was well done and very, very entertaining. It's, I think, echoing the last two points, Ruth and Philo. I'm from the UST Business School, but I teach social entrepreneurship and venture philanthropy, but I'm also from Sweden, one of the largest, I guess, welfare states in the world historically. And I think if we take Nora's point, that social entrepreneurship and that mindset of innovation and new approaches and openness can also be applied to the state, to businesses, and to all the actors that need to work collectively towards social impact. If that's how we would all define social entrepreneurship, I'm moving to that side as well. But I think we come back to then what we heard from Janto about the definitions, and it would be interesting to hear from all of you what your definition would be of social entrepreneurship, because I think that is if we can have this more inclusive, all-encompassing approach, well done, Nora, then I think we will actually have something very, very exciting to communicate to all the different actors that need to be involved, including the government, including corporates, including communities and civil society.
Okay, fantastic. So you might have one person moving across. We'll wait and see. Okay, so let's get some reflections. We'll start off on this side. So the first question around data, the data revolution, and the need, therefore, for the term social entrepreneurship as a result of this data revolution. The second question or reflection on social entrepreneurship being more successful in failed states or in developing countries where there isn't a strong welfare state. The third was a comment about the need to disentangle social entrepreneurship as an approach or social entrepreneurship as a tool or organizational model, i.e. through social enterprise. And the fourth, a question for us all just to give a definition of what we think social entrepreneurship is. So we'll start off from this side and then we'll come back to you guys over here.
You want me to do all four?
We'll ask our panelists to choose the one or two questions that they feel most passionate about.
Okay, well, you directed the data question at me, so I guess I better try and answer that. We're in grave danger, I think, globally of fetishizing data. We think big data is somehow going to solve everything because we now have more information. The truth is the opposite, actually. The more data we collect, the harder it is to manage it and to understand what it's telling us. So actually, I think we should be much more careful about the data we collect and what the purpose of the collection is. And so what I think you see when you look at impact data or the processes we're in now to establish standards for impact data, they're being much more selective and careful about what it is we're trying to measure and why. So I think these are the questions you have to ask. Now, that may well be collected via technology. Of course, mobile telephony is becoming a huge tool for collecting real-time data from the front line, particularly in developing countries, about banking or about other systems. So we can use technology. I'm not a technophobe, but I think we've got to get away from fetishizing. If we can just get more and more and more data, we'll somehow have a epiphany and understand the world better than we did before. Actually, it could be the opposite. We get more confused. So I think data is powerful and important. It needs to be robust and real, but we need to be very careful about how we design data collection, particularly on impact and what the purpose of it is, rather than just collecting more and more. I don't know if that answers your question, but come back to me on that. Do you want to say anything about that?
About the data? Okay. I think I'd like to say something about the welfare state. Yeah, as you're right. I mean, like especially for Scandinavian countries, a lot of you have a really good welfare regime, welfare states, but then you're also facing problems like the aging population. So less and less people are actually paying tax. So in this case, the welfare state is also facing the problem of, do we have enough money to take care of such a big to pay out the welfare, right? So in this case, I think the public sector do need innovation in a way. So they also need they also need to be entrepreneurial in a way to think about how they can effectively collaborate with other stakeholders in a country, and then to resolve different problems such as refugee problem and also the aging population. Yes. So yeah, that would be my answer. And for the data, you know, when you mentioned about the question, the first word came into my mind was AI. So I was thinking like AI cannot be social entrepreneur. Only human can be social entrepreneur. So.
And maybe a quick definition, one sentence definition.
Social entrepreneurship.
Yeah.
So, okay. So. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to define social entrepreneurship. That's big responsibility. And I do agree with Philo. Actually, Philo has already defined what social entrepreneurship is. It's basically, it's a mindset. It's approach to achieve social impact. So no matter who you are, no matter where you are, as long as you have the passion to solve social problems or to solve environmental problems, your aim is to, you know, to achieve social impact, then you can show your entrepreneurship. And then resources, not necessarily money. It could be any type of resources, human capital, social capital, you know. So yeah, so for me, social entrepreneurship really is an entrepreneurial spirit to solve social problem and environmental problem. Thank you.
Well, I would just, yeah, totally agree. I would just add this notion of hybridity, which I think Nora so brilliantly brought out in your, even though you haven't moved, you basically agree with us. You all agree now with us, but you haven't moved yet, which is that this is everywhere. And I think the notion that whatever this, you know, kind of loose and baggy monster is called social entrepreneurship, whatever it is, it can be across sectors, it can be within sectors, and that's its kind of ubiquity that means we're right.
Okay. Meng, Simon, there are 4 questions for you to reflect on there. There's a microphone coming.
Yes, I'll take the welfare state one because it's the only thing I know anything about. And yeah, social entrepreneurship is more successful in failing welfare states. And people have noticed that. So we have Mohammed Yunus, used to be Chancellor of our university. He came over to Glasgow, tried to introduce microfinance, and found there's a long and proud tradition of working class women in Glasgow refusing to pay moneylenders. Anyway, he felt the problem was our welfare state, so he said to our principal, is there any way you could have a word with government and, you know, get rid of this thing called the welfare state? It's stopping me doing social entrepreneurship. And this has been going on now for 30, 40 years. We've been dismantling our welfare state in the name of social entrepreneurship so that we can do good things, and hopefully we can get rid of it, create more poverty, and then you can all come along and solve it for us. Can I say what social entrepreneurship is? Yeah. Actually, I'll let you have a go.
You're going to be yes. Yeah, you're going to have the defining moment on this. So, actually, I think there's a Philo's differentiation between the mindset and approach is really great comment. In terms of mindset, it definitely is more persuasive, right? You find it anywhere. Even in different kinds of states. For strong states, but a weak civil society, that might be a tool for the government, for the public sector solution. For weak state, but a very strong civil society, that might be a great tool for self-organization. But even for the context where you have weak state and you have a strong state, right? But also very strong civil society, or weak on both sides. And social entrepreneurship can also play kind of a role. Because, as I said, it's only part of the solution. Nobody can solve the social problem alone. So state and civil society have to come together somehow. Even before you are kind of in conflicts or tensions, but when it comes to solving pollution issue, some aging issue, you have to figure out what is crossing point. And social entrepreneurship will be right in that at the point to bring different parties together. So, but my point is that if you want to solve social problems, the mindset have to come down to the approach or an entity or kind of organize the behavior. But when you come down to this level, I think social entrepreneurship becomes much more controversial or challenging. It's not just a great idea to solve something. You have to face organizational management issue. You have to face human, nature issue. right? So we have seen so many cases, I would say, greenwashing, social washing. And even, for example, social passion, social compassion, social mission, are they necessarily good for organizational success? Maybe they can work in different stages. At the very beginning, when you set up the startup, the passion can drive you to go along and work 24 hours per day. But when you really grow fast, that may somehow compromise the organization because your leadership may not really, be appropriate for organizational development at all if you have that kind of ego-based leadership. So what I'm trying to say is that when you come down to a solution, organizational model, we need to take a more broader and realistic understanding of social entrepreneurship rather than saying that as a solution for problems, right? So I give it to you for the definition.
I'll leave the definition. I think we're winning the argument without me saying anything else.
Okay, so in a moment I'm going to come around and ask for one final set of reflections or questions from the floor. But before I do that, I have noticed, and I'm going to try and be a very fair chair. There were some people that came in. So for the people that came in, you need to decide which side of the room you want to sit on. So if you are in favor of this motion, social entrepreneurship can solve all social problems, then you can sit on this side. If you are against it, then you need to move onto this side. And then you have a final chance to be persuaded in the last few minutes of the debate, and at the end we will have one final chance for you to move. But if you just came in, please decide where you want to sit, this side or this side, and move accordingly. Okay.
There's one question there from.
And there's a question at the end, at the back. Okay, so we'll take some questions and reflections now. So can we grab a microphone for Professor Su?
Su Wei-Sun from Hong Kong Baptist University. I would like to change the question a little bit. Social entrepreneurship can solve all social problems. Do you believe? I believe, and I wish you all move right here, because this is the way that we can move the community. We can change the community. I would like to share. I just leave the question right here. Do you believe? I'm sorry I twisted your questions.
Okay, thank you. So, an addition to the question, a question or reflection from Mark just here. Can we grab the microphone? Yeah.
I'm Mark Haler. I'm a member of the fastest growing social problem in the world, which is the aging society. You can see I'm a bit geriatric. The only cure I know for old age is death, but I don't want to talk about that. What I really want to know is, I look at the world now and I see two problems that are facing me as a Brit. I'm British, although I live in Hong Kong and I've lived here for a very long time. But I look at Brexit and I see the social division in Brexit. How is social entrepreneurship going to solve the social division in the UK? I'm worried about my grandchildren. I love my grandchildren. I want to know what sort of world they're going to live in. What sort of world, what kind of environment are they going to face? And I look at Donald Trump. How is social entrepreneurship going to persuade Donald Trump and all his many, many followers that climate change is not a hoax, that actually it's real? And how do you combat that kind of view through social entrepreneurship? I think social entrepreneurship can do a great deal, but it cannot do it alone. You need other actors, other people involved. But they can be the spur. Social entrepreneurs can be the spur to wider thinking, more action from others. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so just looking around for your final opportunity for any last questions or reflections. Okay. Okay, brilliant. So, so I'm going to take an opportunity for each side to respond to those final thoughts there. And after we've done that, you'll have 1 minute from each side for you to choose who it's going to be to make your final persuasive argument. And it was only a matter of time before Trump and Brexit were going to come up. So we tried to avoid it, but we couldn't. So.
Okay, so I'd like to respond to that gentleman's comment about whether social entrepreneurship can deal with the problems such as Brexit and Trump. But I think, social entrepreneurship is not equal to social entrepreneur. It's not one social entrepreneur. Social entrepreneurship could be collective. If there are a lot of people showing social entrepreneurship, then probably one day the impact that caused by Trump or the impact of Brexit will be buffered or alleviated to some extent. And again, I also want to mention about social washing and greenwashing. Indeed, we've seen a lot of social enterprises being set up to do social washing and greenwashing, but but then I don't think they are demonstrating any of the social entrepreneurship. They are just pretend to be socially entrepreneurial. So for example, like PMQ, I'm not trying to be offending anyone here, but PMQ in Hong Kong is a high-end social enterprise. They try to, for example, they try to promote local Hong Kong designer brands, but they are only helping designers coming from rich family backgrounds. They're not really helping grassroots designers. So in this case, there's a power struggle that mentioned by Alex again. So how can we really empower marginalized groups? So to avoid social washing and greenwashing. So that's real social entrepreneurship, and it's collective. So.
Right, Brexit, Trump. Mark, I'll just defer to my friend and colleague Paul Collier's brand new book, The Future of Capitalism. And it sounds like one of many books which have come out in the last 10 years, but I do recommend it to you all if you haven't picked it up yet, because the heart of his argument as an economist or development economist is to simply go back to the origins of economics, which is, of course, Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments is the most important book he wrote, not the one people think about. And his basic point is the only way we bridge these terrible divisions in society is to go back to the basic rules of community and reciprocity in our economic systems. And it's easy to say that, but hard to do. But I recommend the book because he gives a series of practical recommendations for policy and also for activity on the ground to try to bridge some of these gaps by going back to see what we can learn from history. So he's a far smarter guy than I am, but I would recommend that.
Okay. Right.
Well, I think that's exactly this gentleman, the kind of a problem social entrepreneurship cannot afford to solve alone. So I think maybe there's another important point is how do we place social entrepreneurship in whose hands? Well, if you place social entrepreneurship in the type of leader that have resources or awareness or capability to solve systematic problem, that would definitely make it better compared to some conventional models, right? Like philanthropy, CSR, or inefficient public sector models. But if you put entrepreneurship, maybe not social entrepreneurship in the hands of a kind of a leader, that will think about the world in a very different way. That will even make the things worse. So social entrepreneurship combining with the right people, with the right resources, that can maximize its power, I think.
I'll just come over to your side again. So I like Donald Trump. He's a great socially entrepreneurial leader. Now, one thing about social entrepreneurs is they look at problems differently, they reframe problems, they create new equilibria. You're worried about getting old? Have a new pair of shoes, sir.
Okay. So we're now going to hand over to your final 1 minute arguments to try to make anybody who is on the verge of moving from one side to the other to make your final choice. So I'm going to invite one person from each team to make a final case to the audience.
So I'm really confused why you haven't moved. I think our esteemed colleagues over here are basically agreeing with us. Seems the only critique they have is to say that some social entrepreneurs get it wrong. Well, you show me any organizations that get it wrong sometimes. And the point is, do you learn from it? And social entrepreneurs do learn from their mistakes, just like any entrepreneur. But it seems to me the agreement here, and that Nora's so eloquently put forward, is that social entrepreneurship is everywhere and driving change across all sectors. So from that point of view, surely you should be agreeing with the motion.
We're not allowed to move until I tell them to. That's why they haven't moved
Okay, boss.
Okay, final reflections from this side.
Right, thank you. So I think about social entrepreneurship is definitely great is much better than many conventional models, but I think it could be risky, really, to overestimate the importance of social entrepreneurship. I think maybe what I'm trying to argue about is we need to return social entrepreneurship into what it actually is. So when we talk about social entrepreneur, we're talking about the kind of approach or processes, being innovative, different from conventional ways of solving problems, taking some risks, be fully committed or focused on solving social problems. So even when you grow fast, or even when you're under pressure, you do not easily drift your mission, something like that. So if we return it to these basic elements, but at the same time, we do not ignore other elements that make it into trouble. For example, the normal issues that can make any organization fail, can make any venture business fail. We should not ignore that. We should not believe because you're conducting social entrepreneurship, you're always ethically justified. You're always in the right position to make change happen. It doesn't necessarily happen. So again, our point is that social entrepreneurship is great if yourself first become the kind of a person that have the capability and resources to solve some problem together with other people. Then you build up your own social entrepreneurship that will make it do it even better and more sustainably. All right, thank you very much.
Okay, so now for the moment of truth. I'm going to do it in stages. So if you were on this side, so it means you were in favor of the motion. It's now your opportunity. If you've been persuaded by these guys, then you can move over here. Is anybody going to move? No? Okay. And if you were against the motion at the beginning and you've been persuaded by Nora and Alex, then please move over to this side. So wow, so just by a margin of one, you only managed to persuade one person. I'm not sure whether that's a reflection on the, yeah, anyway. Let's invite Kevin to tell us why he moved.
No. Well, I believe that social entrepreneurship is an approach and it's a mindset. I think everybody can acquire it, and I think Alex made the last comment is convinced me. I think people could make mistakes. So some social entrepreneurs can make mistakes, and I think so. If you have an approach, you make mistakes. It doesn't mean that this is not good. I think now we are learning more and more from the lessons, and I think with this good approach, we could use this good approach to solve a lot of problems. So that's why I moved.
Okay.
But only one.
So only one person moved across. Okay, well, before we conclude this session, I'm very curious to hear what Yanto thinks about this question, since he was the one that came up with the motion in the first place.
Yeah, blame it all on me on the questions. Yes, you could reframe it. That's a very good question. You are actually a social entrepreneur yourself. You like to reframe any questions so we can get a new answer from Professor Siu. If you ask me, I'm for the motion because I define social entrepreneurship as a mindset instead of a tool or an organization or a very specific. So mine is I'm embracing the mindset and the approach, so it can exist in all areas. However, if you recall what happened 700-800 years ago, when someone said the Earth is the center of the universe, and until there's an invention of a telescope by Galileo, and we start to know that there is another bigger star called the Sun, in which we are circumnavigating. So with that invention of that new tool, it changes how people see the reality. So I'm stopping here to say that I agree with this motion, but I have to say there's still a lot of things, a lot of research needs to be done for us to know more about what is the limitations or the boundary conditions of social entrepreneurship. We don't know that much yet, even though the research has been ongoing for how many years? 20 years? 30 years? We still need to know more. We still need to get more data, to get more evidence to know where the limit is. But I'm for this motion. Thank you. What about you? What about you?
I actually agree as well. I mean, I think that there's a lot of questions around. It's a question around language, and we describe social entrepreneurs in different ways throughout history. And in fact, it's always people that change the world. So if we call them social entrepreneurs, that's fine by me. Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for participating, and most importantly, thank you very much for our panelists for being such good sports this morning and for putting themselves out there, arguing for these two positions. I think it's a really interesting and engaging way to start this academic forum. So thank you very much for your participation.
We'll have 15 minutes break, and we'll come back with research sharing by 4 great international scholars. Join us in 15 minutes. Okay, I think without further ado, let's just kickstart this event. I'm Yanto Chandra from City University of Hong Kong, for some of you who came late. So the first part, we had a very interesting and lively debate, and hopefully you are entertained as well as enlightened by the discussions, and have started to form your own thinking about what social entrepreneurship is and what it can do for us and for the society. We're going to kickstart the second part, which is a research sharing, in which we have invited 4 international speakers. We have Dr. Kate Cooney from Yale University, and then we have Professor Ruth Phillips from University of Sydney, and then we have Dr. Michael Roy from Glasgow Caledonian University, and lastly, Professor Simon Teasdale, again, from Glasgow Caledonian University. Each of them will have 8 to 10 minutes to share what they think about what's next in social entrepreneurship research. It's very common, as a tradition in academia, for us to take a pulse, to know what happened in the past, what we already know in a field, in which case this is about the social entrepreneurship, what we don't know about that field, which is social entrepreneurship, and what are the hot and new topics of research that scholars think are worth pursuing, or the kind of areas that we think will set the trend in the next maybe 5 or 10 years in this field. So without further ado, let's welcome the first presenter, Dr. Kate Cooney, please.
Thank you so much to Dr. Yanto Chandra and the organizing committee for inviting me. We've been asked to speak about what we know about social enterprise research, what's hot, and what can we do to bridge the local practitioner and policy community with the research community. I'm going to spend most of my time on that middle question, what's hot, what's new, but to set that up, I'm just going to say a little bit about what we know. One way that many of us in the research community have pursued research on social enterprises to use institutional theory to help us think about social enterprises as hybrid organizations, right? Organizations that at the organizational level are combining these different, sometimes divergent institutional logics, the logics of the market with the logic of community and social welfare. And that this requires managing human resources with the requisite business and social sector skills for integrated action towards blended but not always compatible goals. And this research on social enterprise hybridity has developed important insights regarding the ability of organizational practices to reduce that conflict that can occur between these logics within organizations. And so from this large body of research, we've developed some important insights into the importance at the organizational level of creating these spaces for discussion and negotiation between the two logics, in terms of hiring, selection, and socialization into the enterprise. We've learned some important things about perhaps hiring for potential and then training in these blended skill sets, about a good strategy of using incentive structures that create performance measurement bonuses for process as well as end goals can be very important. And in a nice paper by Myra Brezoff, looking at the importance of those pluralist managers within these firms, right? Managers that can speak both the language of capitalism and the language of passionate idealism as important middle management criteria for holding these two parts of the organization together and the motivation of the staff. We've created new legal forms for social enterprise to help social entrepreneurs harness both capital markets for growth while integrating a kind of mission lock and allow these corporations to maintain a commitment to a broader set of stakeholders. We've learned a lot in the research about who's adopting these new forms and have some nice papers helping entrepreneurs think about the right form to choose for your venture. And then there's been a whole host of research on scaling these organizations, right? Once you get that business model, get that right set of human resources, how do you get the financing and the right metrics to scale? And we've seen the emergence of new financial vehicles to help fund these initiatives. So in terms of what's new and what's hot, I think many of us are turning now to this question that has been mentioned about to what end, right? That system change question, right? So hybrid social organizations often operate at two levels. First, at that organizational level, where we've done all this work around capacity building and scaling. But many of them are operating at a second level, at the field level, aiming for broader system change. And that really opens up this new space for research, and a lot of us are turning to this to really think about to what extent are these organizational models actually pushing toward broader system change. And just as an orienting quote, I have this quote from Jamie Peck and Nick Theodore in their recent book on progressive policy diffusion. And they say, these happenstance mutations and little victories on their own will never be enough to disrupt the hegemonic pattern itself or to challenge the authority of the most fortified power centers. Right? And I think that's the question many of us are wondering, to what extent are social enterprises maybe happy little victories battling, but untouching of these larger hegemonic forces that are producing the inequalities and the poverty that these social enterprises are intervening around. Right? And so what's very exciting sort of theoretically is that we have a new set of there's a lot of new writing occurring at the intersection of social movement theory and institutional theory that's very well primed to help us think about that research agenda, right? And so older institutional models of how a happy little victory diffuses into broader system change emphasizes prevalence, proximity, exposure, emulation as that process whereby an alternative set of practices diffuse to the broader population. But what social movement theory brings to that analysis is the importance of mobilization, right? So that according to this approach, paths of diffusion have to be viewed as sequences of movements, mobilizations, and institutional processes. These institutional processes don't just occur automatically, right? And so without that mobilization, any kind of prior adoption pattern will not automatically translate into future adoption. It is when champions of these alternatives mobilize and shift the balance of power that those institutional processes can kick in. Right? And so as part of my own research inquiry into this system change space, I've been doing some comparative analysis of two cases. One is the Benefit Corporation and the group behind the establishment of this new corporate form that is meant to both provide social entrepreneurs with a form that allows for stakeholder, not just shareholder management, but also wants to change capitalism itself, right? And a second initiative, which is the Democracy Collaborative, which is really attempting to disseminate forms of community-controlled capital. And so they are actually looking back to Mondragon, the network of worker-owned cooperatives in the Basque region of Spain, and imitating that strategy in Rust Belt cities in the United States, and combining that kind of network of worker-owned cooperatives with an anchor-based strategy for community economic development, where you get those big anchors like universities and hospitals to move some of their supply chain purchasing to these worker-owned cooperatives. And so just to highlight very briefly, because I know I'm running out of time, what this kind of intersection of social movement theory and institutional theory can help us think about with these two cases. The first is this idea that challenger movements build new organizational forms into fields in alternative systems of organization. And we see the Benefit Corporation, for sure, building this alternative kind of corporation. And with the Evergreen case, they themselves are looking back in time to the 1950s establishment of Mondragon as an inspiration, right? That to delegitimate current taken for granted norms, you must create debate and spur diffusion. It won't just happen on its own. And part of doing that is to supply reformers with these alternative templates, right? And one of the things that in the research on benefit corporations, we've seen a lot of talk about adoption, but how do we know that's really changing that broader system, right? So many of us were looking first along industry lines. If we see a lot of manufacturing firms adopting the benefit corp, do we see the broader industry changing its practices? But more recent research by George Serafim at Harvard, which points out that a set of stock analysts for the first time in the last few years have begun to rate firms with high levels of CSR practices positively rather than negatively, as they have for decades in the past, is perhaps a window into the way this kind of diffusion might occur, right? Not at the industry level, but at that level of norms, where these taken for granted earlier established norms that heavy investment in CSR is somehow at odds with economic performance are beginning to be challenged by some of these new models. And then I'll just sort of skip to the last point because I know I'm running out of time. But there's this notion in this theoretical agenda that diffusing practices can be vulnerable to editing and modification as they travel. And one of the things that I'm noticing as I'm watching the Evergreen Cooperative initiative attempt to spread, and there is something like, 30 or 40 cities that are looking at what they've built in Cleveland around this imitation of Mondragon and trying to emulate it, is that in some cases they are deciding not to try to set up worker-owned cooperatives, but instead to buy businesses and flip them to worker ownership, and in some cases are dropping the worker ownership piece altogether, right? So it raises questions about expediency versus retention of those core commitments that mobilized these efforts to begin with. So just to wrap up, I think what's hot is a new focus on systems change, right? Not just the organizations, but how they are contributing. What are they adding up toward? We'd had some earlier work in institutional theory to help us think about agency, this institutional work literature, but this newer interest in combining social movements theory with institutional theory is very hot right now and can be very helpful in helping us think through those diffusion mechanisms and focus on them so we can understand them. And I think it also there's also room for, I'll save number 3 for the question and answer. And then on my very last point, I literally have one three-word phrase, but in terms of thinking about connecting research and practice and policy, I think we need to focus on building epistemic communities, and I'll leave my explanation of that for the Q&A. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. That's Kate Cooney from Yale School of Management. She has done a lot of research and published on work integration social enterprises, as well as on poverty, as well as on B Corps, which is a very nice areas. And I think the systemic change is a hot topic. Yeah. Without further ado, the next speaker will be Professor Ruth Phillips. She's coming from a social work background. She's also done a lot of research on NGOs, and I've been to one of her talks talking about illegal microfinance in some Southeast Asian countries. It's very interesting. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Ruth Phillips.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I should start by saying the main reason I'm here is because I'm representing ISTR, the International Society for Third Sector Research, and we hope to build stronger relationships with the SEC group in the future. So I'm not, unlike Kate, and Kate did a great job of establishing a theoretical paradigm, if you like, for our discussions, because that's not my area of kind of academic research. I've been working in the third sector research space for a very long time, which is a much broader and more encompassing concept that includes non-profits through to social enterprise, if you like. And I guess I also should say that my particular theoretical interests are more about the relationship between political theory and the third sector, because I'm a political scientist, even though I teach in social work. And in particular, in the broad political context, the impact of neoliberalism. And today, I thought, because I was trying to answer the question, I'm going to focus on what is happening in Australia. It's not necessarily my research, but at the end, I will come to the key questions where my research interests intersect the social enterprise, if you like. So, just to give you an idea, in Australia, the largest research centre on social enterprise is the Centre for Social Impact, which is based at 3 different universities, not the University of Sydney. And it was established under a Conservative government, John Howard's government. It was his gesture of setting up this group of research centres in a kind of commitment to continued neoliberal interface with the sort of community sector. And I'll come back to that idea. So the University of New South Wales, Swinburne University and the University of Western Australia are the 3 universities that have this sort of really strong focus on social enterprise and social impact. And they're particularly, over the last few years, one of the major foci, if you like, is around mapping the social enterprise sector in Australia, because even though it's been around for quite a long time, it hasn't been a strong area of academic research. And one of the leading researchers, Joe Barakat, who's at the Swinburne Centre for Social Impact, talks about social enterprise, or the enterprising non-profit sector, as she calls it, and the presence of cooperative and mutual businesses, and the practice of social enterprise is actually relatively mature, but the language remains marginal and contested in the Australian context. So given that, I guess it's interesting to see where it's going and what's hot, which is certainly not necessarily the research I've been doing, even though I've been looking at marketisation of human services, which kind of is a part and parcel of this process. So social enterprise and community enterprise have been around since the 1970s in Australia, and have been early forms were very much in the form that Kate's just been talking about, sort of cooperative and mutual forms of organising. But I have to say, since we've had a lot of Conservative governments over that period, we've seen a demise of the union movement, and when you have the demise of worker movements, you see the demise of cooperatives as well, and the impact of that on collective solutions to sort of failing industries and shifts of economies, if you like. The social enterprise and social entrepreneurship were first introduced in 1999 through the social enterprise network. And I guess, you know, we saw lots of definitions so far of what social entrepreneurship, but social enterprise in particular has, in the Australian context, is very much defined by its drivers of economic, social, cultural or environmental missions for public benefit. And they place people at the centre of their business, which we saw at the beginning of this conference, a very strong focus on that. And they trade profitably to fulfil their mission. And I think this is a very distinctive and interesting feature. And we've also seen an increase in the number of social enterprises that reinvest their profits or surpluses to fulfill their mission, but I think there's another group that actually reinvest to grow their enterprise, not necessarily fulfill their mission. And we do see quite a lot of engagement, particularly under Conservative governments, a very popular idea because they can reduce expenditure on welfare and pursue their sort of neoliberal goals and pass social problems over to the sort of social enterprise sector. And because we are a highly regulated country still, there is quite a high level of transparency because of the legal requirements of the business side of incorporation into associations or corporations. So the state of play in the Australian context is really, the government is very fond of this sector at the moment. We've had I know that it seems like we change governments a lot, but we just change prime ministers a lot. And the current government, which is a Conservative government, is very fond of looking at ways of supporting but not it costing them anything for the sector. So one thing about the social enterprise, it's fairly marginal in terms of investment and has fairly small scale policy effects. And because it's a highly regulated economy, it's been limited in terms of investment from across the board. Just for example, crowdfunding is a kind of popular way of supporting social problems, if you like, social solutions to social problems. And recently there have been amendments to make it more feasible to use crowdfunding for social enterprise. And the Australian government, business and large human service organisations are really being heavily influenced at the moment towards increasing their social enterprise components by government policy through mainly taxation incentives. And the Australian government has a kind of community business partnerships where they're investing quite a lot of money, particularly into research on how they can grow this area. And they're particularly interested in technologies and platforms for giving and volunteering. And they're really looking at social impact investment as a growth area and program-related investment, particularly in relation to the issues we heard about earlier of aged care and, in fact, the environment to some extent for children, childcare, so the two ages, ends of the spectrum. So I might just see how long have I've only got 3 minutes, okay. So as I said before, one of the big things that's happened over the last few years is a kind of mapping of social enterprise. So this is quite a good summary of the map that was done by the Swinburne Social Enterprise Centre. It's a really, it shows that we have up to 20,000 social enterprise in Australia. That they're mainly small business models, and some 23% medium size. And then the smallest group, but the longest in terms of history are the social enterprises within large not-for-profit human service organisations that have always had some component. And on an international level, you might think about Oxfam, for example, that has its online fair trade store. But we have our big charitable, what used to be charitable organisations, looking at their own fundraising through that. So I'd just like to go and give you some examples of where I think some of the tensions and interests in terms of the types of social enterprise, given I said before 70% are of this commercial model where, you know, really, are they social enterprises, are they just good firms? But they tend to be started up by young entrepreneurs, and Who Gives a Crap is one of them. They sell great recycled products and they fund sanitation projects. But 50% of their profits go to these projects and the other 50% go to growing their firm. And then we've got the other alternative, the Bread and Butter Project, where 100% of their profits go to training refugees to become bakers, and that's their purpose. You know, they are really focused on what is a social change, if you like, focus rather than a kind of charitable focus. And then social traders, which are probably well known to some of you, a very long-term organisation that really looks getting unemployed people into work. So I'm going to skip down now to my research questions because I've run out of time. But one of the questions I think for me, from looking at from a broad third sector perspective, is because I've seen this growth in social entrepreneurship in partnership with the incredible shift of corporate sector people moving into third sector or not-for-profit organisations and taking them over and turning them into kind of corporatised entities. And the main reason when you ask people why they do that is they say, well, they weren't getting enough personal satisfaction from the corporate sector, so they want to do good and move into the not-for-profit sector. But in doing that, they kind of begin to diminish the mission, perhaps, of those organisations. The other question, I guess, and you know, is that a conscientisation of the market sector seeking higher reward? And does the shift to social enterprise reflect a kind of demise of neoliberalism when the enthusiasm for purely market rewards is diminishing? So that's a big question, but I think it's an interesting one. And then I guess what really interests me, and I revealed this in my question before, is what's the sustainability of social enterprise for good social and human service provision, and how much impact is it having on state responsibilities for welfare and employment policies? And I think that's a really important question because although I think I've seen fabulous projects here and I know that people do really great things, that kind of very focused, individualised sort of success doesn't solve a social problem. And I do question this sort of linking it to social change, because social change requires very, widespread change of thinking. And because I do a lot of stuff around domestic violence and gender, yet to see any kind of social enterprise change the way men think about women in relation to gender power, for example. And I'll finish on that note. Thank you.
I'm Kevin Au. I'm going to introduce the third speaker, Michael Roy. Michael is from Glasgow Unit Centre for Social Business and Health, and his research interest on impact of social enterprises, and also one of my own favorite subject, which is ecosystems. So let's put our hands together. Welcome Michael on the stage.
Hi everyone, I don't have any slides and I have this crazy Glaswegian accent, so please just if you can't understand me, then please just put your hand up and I'll do what I can to slow down and be very clear and precise. So focusing on what's new and hot in social entrepreneurship scholarship, I'm going to focus on research, obviously, because that's what I do. I'm a sociologist. We were talking about this over breakfast this morning, a number of sociologists who find themselves working in business schools, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. My background's in economic sociology and social policy, And I've been working at the Eunice Centre for Social Business and Health for quite a while now. It's actually grown to become one of the largest centres for the study of social enterprise, social entrepreneurship, social innovation in the world over the last 8 years or so. I try to maintain quite a wide perspective on this subject. And that's helpful in my role with the Social Enterprise Journal that Simon and I are editors. Oh, he's the editor. I'm the deputy editor. I was going to say I'm the one who does all the work, but he's actually left the room, and so he's not here to defend himself. So, and it's not true anyway. So I get a pretty good insight into what we might term the kind of bleeding edge of social enterprise scholarship, or social entrepreneurship scholarship, whatever you want to call it. And I review a lot of papers, okay? I'm not saying that all the articles that I see necessarily fall into the category of bleeding edge by any means, but I do. Here are 5 areas that I think are kind of pretty hot. First of all, social enterprise and well-being. Believe it or not, although social enterprise researchers have been saying that social enterprises exist to support or promote the well-being of the people on the planet rather than profits for shareholders, and they've been saying it for at least the last decade or so. Believe it or not, there's actually still very little research coming through dealing with how and in what ways social enterprises actually impact upon well-being. And my work and that of my colleagues in Glasgow is probably the only research centre with kind of critical mass on that particular area. There are others. Joe's Centre in Swinburne, for example, has been doing some work in this area, and others are dabbling, but no one's really been looking at this in any kind of systemic way. And I think that's a bit of a missed opportunity, because there's a lot of stuff around well-being which is actually very, very interesting. It's a hot topic just now, generally speaking, but I actually think it's one we could probably mine for some nuggets of gold, shall we say. Secondly, how and what ways can social enterprises impact on the global political economy? Okay, we kind of touched upon this earlier this morning. Moving beyond sticking plaster solutions to problems to address what we might term some of the upstream causes of problems. There's some very nice research over the last few years has revealed how the global political economy is enacted and played out in a myriad of often pretty mundane, everyday ways, if you like. It shapes our everyday lives. We've seen how markets have come to dominate more or less every facet of our everyday existences. And that has some pretty devastating consequences, frankly, on our well-being. So the rise of kind of populism across the globe, for example, but we also know that a myriad of everyday actions can actually add up to an awful lot, so can affect structural changes too, or at least we think that might be the case. So I think there are plenty of lessons we can probably apply there, particularly the intersection of kind of political economy, political science. Particularly, we've already had the sociology of social movements, for example, can probably help us move the conversation forward. Again, if you're working on such problems and you're thinking of researching, then please drop us a line at Social Enterprise Journal. We'd be delighted to have a conversation with you if you're interested in developing a paper along those lines. My third area is learning from the Global South. Okay, I was actually inspired recently by a lecture given by Diane Holt at the University of Essex, and she's probably the world's leading expert on social enterprise and entrepreneurship in the sub-Saharan Africa. But the infinite capacity of people to innovate, particularly where kind of deep necessity really is the mother of invention, it often occurs despite of, or indeed encouraged by, structural institutional voids. And we've already heard this morning again about social entrepreneurship working to address areas at the bottom, the so-called bottom of the pyramid, particularly where the state is largely absent. I think there's so much more we could learn from areas that are not the West, or indeed by people who are necessarily trained in Anglo-Saxon business schools. So they were just frankly not simply capturing that kind of stuff. There are, of course, good impediments to researchers who are not, whose language is not English or whatever, and who are not trained in such manner as to actually penetrate the top journals. And again, we'll try and do what we can in order to help people along in that regard. We can't write it for you, but at the same time, that's why I think projects like BRICS, for example, is really important in terms of improving capacity and looking at areas in which we can work together to try and overcome some of these really structural obstacles to moving the conversation forward. My fourth area concerns critical policy-based research that moves away from simply talking about or describing specific settings or contexts to understanding how policy ideas travel and mutate, etc. Kate mentioned Jamie Peck's work from economic geography. That's really important work, and I think we can probably use and employ that material quite much better than we have done to date. And this is kind of linked to that point. It never ceases to amaze me how, particularly when we come to Asia, how you can take an idea that perhaps has emerged in the UK or the US and then twist it into something, a new shape that's uniquely your own. It's suited to your own context. You imprint your own culture on it. It becomes something new, exciting, dynamic. This mixture of policy adaptation, mutation, similarly provides some quite fascinating areas, I think, that we would like to know more about. But we'd also like to know more about some of the implications of this creolization of ideas, a creolization of policy and culture, etc., including what some of the unintended consequences of that are. But we also need to move beyond description to working out what the implications are, wider implications for field building and indeed legitimising social enterprise research into much broader areas such as social policy. Simon and Alex have done some great work in this area recently. Simon's also done some work with Pascal Day, who's a very clever Swiss sociologist in this area. And but I think that there is some real potential for really excellent scholarship in this area. First of all, the fifth hot topic, this is my final hot topic. It concerns moving beyond ideas themselves to how ideas are framed, to draw upon an idea from sociology again. So the language of social enterprise, social entrepreneurship, social innovation has, as I said, been shaped and dominated by scholarship undertaken in the West. And thus everything else is judged in comparison to that, for better or for worse. So is the current lexicon that we have available to us adequate to describe the myriad of different practices that people are employing to address, in their own unique way, the innumerable social problems that people face on a day-to-day basis? For example, I was in New Zealand last year. I met Alex Hannant over there for the first time, and some of us were also there. Tristan was there as well. And we were really treated to some really fabulous ideas, particularly Maori culture, indigenous entrepreneurship, and it was really awesome. It was really made us understand about the fact that economic organising doesn't have to be just via the markets. You know, there's all sorts of stuff around community reciprocity and so on and so forth that has largely been fairly absent from conversations, particularly from management scholars. But then they would say things like talk about SROI and talk about social return on investment, and using language which is actually completely it rankled about with me in terms of describing stuff that they were doing, and it's almost as if they didn't have a language to describe it on their own. They did have a language to describe it on their own terms, but they were importing language to describe that in order to legitimise actions that have been undertaken for frankly many thousands of years and had deep meaning in and of itself. So we need to move beyond kind of importing terminology and try and move beyond understanding things purely through a market lens. And that one's probably a great problem for the economic anthropologists. If we have any in the audience, we'd love to hear from you. But in essence, finally, just what my final point is, the thing that binds all of these 5 hot topics together is they exist where disciplines intersect. They interlace, or they come together, they clash with each other even. So I think I would encourage you all to blur the boundaries a bit, operate in the intersections and develop partnerships outside your disciplinary silos and comfort zones. See what happens. You might actually be surprised. Thanks very much.
The last speaker, Professor Simon Teasdale from Glasgow, Caledonian. He is also the editor of Social Enterprise Journal, one of the 2 dedicated journals on social entrepreneurship. The other is Journal of Social Entrepreneurship, edited by Alex Nichols. Thank you.
Whose side Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. And I'm a really bad professor, and I feel I'm very, very sorry, but I completely misunderstood. So I'm a late replacement for Bob Doherty, and he was going to do this one. And then Yanto asked, would Simon do the session, What's Hot in Social Entrepreneurship Research? And I was deeply honoured. I thought you meant I was hot. So I've completely got the wrong end of the stick, and I've been frantically cobbling something together over the last few minutes. I'm sorry, I'm maybe not hot. Anyway, just editing a book on, I can't remember what it's called, Future Research Agenda in Social Entrepreneurship Research. And to be honest, most of the chapters aren't very good. It's not really worth buying, but if you've got loads of money, buy one anyway. And just to pick out 3 of the lukewarm things. So I think Michael mentioned Pascal Day. He's our friend, so we always plug his work. So he's doing stuff around I can't even say it, river maladies? Can anyone help me with that? All right, river maladies, pretend that's right. And it's really interesting work on microcredit and understanding how social entrepreneurship changed the rhythms of everyday people's lives. So looking at women entrepreneurs in Nepal, people have been understanding how microcredit comes along, and you've got women who are at home looking after children in the home, and suddenly microcredit arrives and it transforms their very lives. They become entrepreneurs. And then go into that in more detail. What happens to the children? What happens to family life as everyone becomes the subjects of capitalism? Other work around field building, and I think Michael might have briefly touched on it when I ran out of the room before, but in a sense, people have done work around social change and field building for years, and how can we learn from Bourdieu, Fligstein, McAdam, work that's been going on there, and bring that together with social entrepreneurship research to understand how do social entrepreneurs create or not create social change, how do they negotiate the barriers, how do fields change their behaviour? And then again, Michael's got all these hot topics in before me, but I just called it below the radar. So we have these grand narratives of social entrepreneurship research. It's all these big heroes. What's happening with all the little people? You know, there's millions of them for every one of the big ones. What are they doing? And can we really understand, perhaps using more ethnographic style research, what's going on in their worlds? And then I knew that I'd need a bit more time here. So my own research, I suppose I look at social entrepreneurship as language, as discourse. I'm interested in how language changes behaviour, in a sense how power works through language to change behaviour. So looking at the UK context, 20 years ago, a lot of people with beards came along. They all had beards, the men and the women, and they were very radical. They wanted to change the world. They believed in equality, not full equality because they wanted to control things, but they were into co-ops, equality, all this, and they used the language of social enterprise to persuade New Labour to take some of their ideas on board. New Labour had just come in. It was an open policy window. They talked about the third way, beyond the market and beyond the state, and this was perfect. Then government takes on ideas, they change them a little bit, it corrupts, and it becomes much more about, hang on, we need to deliver these services, we want to do it cheaply, let's use the third sector, let's turn them all into social enterprises. So then huge sums of money are available to organisations that describe themselves as a social enterprise. All you have to do is call yourself a social enterprise and they'll give you a grant to help you become sustainable. The third sector's been brilliant for years at this, at getting grants to do things and then using it for something else. So they take the money and they go off and do normal things with it. They spend it on what they want to do, achieving their social mission. And I suppose that's resistance to social enterprise discourse, and we're tempted to leave it at that and say, okay, this is all about cunning social entrepreneurs, manipulating government, stupid governments have got it wrong. But then we began exploring this through, I suppose, ignorance, and if you look at it through the eyes of government, the social entrepreneurs are actually, they're going out, they're taking the money, they're doing something different with it, but they're still solving social problems that government wants them to solve. They create a more stable society. So then I suppose what we began to do is, if you look at different types of ignorance, yes, you can have genuine ignorance, and you can assume maybe that's happening in some cases, but we suspect in other cases it's willful ignorance. The government knows what's happening but deliberately ignores it because they're working within the same structures that are constraining them. So they know social entrepreneurs are going out spending money on the wrong things, but hey, things could be worse, let's leave it at that. And then I suppose there's different forms of deviance. So anyway, that's the last hot topic. And I'm fairly lukewarm, so I'll leave it at that. But thank you. And thanks, Tristan.
Before we go to the Q&A sessions, we have an open sharing from Alex Nichols to say a few words or whatever you thought about. We have that.
Are you want me to say something?
Yep.
Did you not read the instructions? No, I didn't read the instructions. Okay. Well, I can't add to that at all. So that was such a good account of the hot topics. I don't know what I can add, but maybe I can say a couple of things. I mean, Kate's comment about the kind of institutionalist approach to this sector and this topic in the literature has been really illuminating, and it's probably the area of management theory that's been most engaged in my mind. So the question is, where do we go beyond that? And I think the engagement with social movements theory is really positive and important, but there should be other opportunities too, which is partly to Michael's point about interdisciplinary work. And one thing we're interested in that we've been working on with our colleagues in Europe, who for the moment are still our colleagues in Europe, we like to think of them as our colleagues, on a big project for 4 years for the European Union, is addressing this systemic issue around social change from an economic sociology perspective, but very much from a kind of structuralist perspective. So we've borrowed from the work of a brilliant man called Jens Beckert. Some of you may know his work. If you haven't read his work before, I strongly recommend it. We've taken some work from him where he looks at the high-level kind of constitutional elements of societies, which he calls the social grid, and that's a triangle that brings together social networks and institutions and what he calls cognitive frames, the ways we see the world. And he sees this triangle that's always dynamically relating across these three elements as being the organizing principle at the high level. So what we've tried to do in this project is say, well, if that's the case, how does that relate to people's real lives? So we've brought in, so this is an example of how you can be multidisciplinary or just get completely lost in theory. So we brought in at the micro level Amartya Sen's work on capabilities. So we've said one measure of systemic change would be to ask people on the ground, has an intervention made a material difference to your ability to flourish as a human being? And this is to some degree to Michael's point about well-being. It's one way of seeing that, I think, through Sen's work. And we use that as our methodological approach to collect data on the ground about impact. But then we still have to connect Beckert's high-level tripartite triangle and these capabilities data that we've been collecting. And so we get a theory of power from Michael Mann. You might know Michael Mann's kind of vast kind of historical sweep of the nature of power globally over 1,000 years, among other things he's done. And so we take categories of power and we build a model that says the social grid from Beckett, slightly modified by us, can be articulated through different types of power to have effects, positive or negative, on people's ability to flourish. And then we take this out and we do some field work and we do some studies and we track that through to see in what ways, if at all, different social enterprises work. So one thing maybe, apart from that is an example of an overly complicated theoretical model we're trying to be employing, and some of the points Michael made are clear in that. For us, the other thing that maybe is not a hot topic, but something I put in front of you, is that we decided we'd do 100-year case studies of 4 social innovations, if you will, like clean water is one of them, social housing is another. And this was really fascinating because we never do that in this field. We do case studies that we look at like today, or maybe 5 years, or maybe less. And that's useful and interesting and important, of course, but we don't often look over history. And for us, it was very revealing because what we saw, and perhaps this won't surprise you, is all kinds of ebbs and flows around how an innovation begins, gets opposed, gets systematized, institutionalized, gets captured by ideology and policy, as Simon was saying, in the UK social enterprise landscape, and how they end up, where they end up. So it's painstaking work to do these kind of big case studies, but for us, it's been really fascinating. So I'd recommend, if you have the interest and time, to do these long-scale case studies to see how innovations embed and disappear over time. That's not what I was asked to do, but it's because I didn't prepare anything. So that's about our work. But I do think, I can't add much to what's been said. I think we've covered interdisciplinary work. We've covered looking at discourses. We've covered management theory and how it can overlap with other kinds of theories. And all of these, I think, are really important areas to push forward. I suppose one other thing I would say is let's have more work about failure. Let's have more work about when this stuff doesn't work, and let's be honest. There is, a critical school that for some time, Pascal and our friends in Glasgow have been pioneering this with others, that says, hang on. Michael will always beat me up over social impact bonds, and whether they're good or bad. But let's have more of that. I think, and as and if we feel this field is maturing, then let's get on with that. Let's look at the bad stuff too, as well as talking it up. I hope that's what you wanted. Thank you.
So we're going to the Q&A sessions. Kevin will moderate the session together with me. May I invite Kate, Ruth, and Simon and Roy to join us in a chair in the front. Okay, let's take questions from the audience. Any questions? Yes. Please introduce yourself and then the questions.
Hello, my name is Karen. Karen Lau from Wolfu Social Enterprises. I have a simple question, but I would like to have your, views and enlighten me a little on that. If we look at social entrepreneurism as like a movement in that way, and if I look at historically what happened in the UK before, I know a little bit about of contracting out public services, how would you as a movement compare the lessons we've learned from contracting out versus introducing social entrepreneurism or social entrepreneurship as a movement right now? What lessons have we learned before that you think can be applied and to make this movement more successful, if that makes sense at all?
So one of the things that's always struck me about social entrepreneurship as a movement is it's all about solving social problems, but nobody ever pins down what's the world that we want, what does that look like? What are we trying to get to? So it's all about solving problems, dealing with homelessness, but what's the world we want to create? And I think if you're going to create a movement that's going to remain true to its principles, you need to begin to set out what these principles actually are in a positive sense, rather than just what we don't want.
I would echo that point. I think if we think about contracting out as one type of shrinking of the welfare state and making it more flexible, it was really motivated by a broader ideology, and so the power of those ideas is an important lesson. So that social enterprise as a movement really needs to think about those powerful ideas that can motivate a whole range of actions and commitments, ideas around equality and fair distribution and so forth that can animate and sustain a whole set of changing practices over time.
It's a really interesting question in the Australian context, because one of the deep effects of contracting out to the non-government sector was to create a silencing of the sector in advocacy terms, and in fact diminishing social movements. And in particular, if you think about the women's movement, they became so captured by new public management requirements and then competitiveness in trying to win contracts that they could no longer be the advocacy movement that they were before. So I guess because social enterprises are seeking capital and investment from other sources other than government, then maybe one of the things is to look at how you can then pick up what social movements are really for, which is social change, and to reclaim that advocacy space. And I guess in that are those key values of what kind of society you want as a whole, and how do you fit into transformative change that makes happiness, which we haven't really talked about today, just shows how alienated academics are from happiness. But yeah. But I think if you want to translate happiness in society, then I would say the best way to reach that is through equality. And equality means you have to challenge all the things that make people unequal and transform the notion of what citizenship is based on the notion of equality. And to me, that's a lesson that directly comes out of the impact of the sort of neoliberalization of services through contracting out. That, yeah.
Can we have, can I say one thing quickly? I think one thing, I mean, to again kind of be self-referential here about what I was just saying about kind of looking at history, I think one thing we need to be aware of is that, you know, we are in a particular moment of ideology, and it may change. I mean, certainly in the UK, there's a backlash, strong backlash against public-private partnerships and outsourcing. There's a long and interesting tradition of nationalisation, which is becoming very popular again in the polls and so on. So an interesting challenge then for the UK social enterprise sector is if they've forever built themselves on government contracts and working with government as opposed to a more traditional role opposing government as the third sector might do, how are they going to adapt to a new political reality where those are not the levers government wants to pull to achieve welfare outcomes? So I think there's got to be some smart thinking, because it may be that history tells us that that particular political economic trend of neoliberalism so on may have reached its high water mark, and we may be coming away to something else. And if you don't adapt to the social enterprise sector, you could be in trouble.
Can we have, yeah. Any?
Yeah, I think Simon actually occasionally says some quite profound things, and occasionally. And I think the notion of what kind of society we want to have is actually a really important one. So we'll look at around the world and look at, well, who are the happiest societies in the world? Well, it's the Nordic Scandinavian countries. But they have a very particular flavour of welfare state as well, where in actual fact the civil society plays a really vital part. So it's not about the state doing everything, it's actually about the state, the market and the civil society in balance. Now, when you start thinking about it this way, this links to Alex's point, then and looking at it historically, when market comes to dominate and the state and civil society are both reduced, that has severe implications for society. And in the last time this happened, so this was the long 19th century, if you like. I work a lot using Cal Polanyi's work, for example, and the great, if you haven't read it, The Great Transformation was published in 1944. Talks about the rise of fascism, the First World War, the Great Depression. All these were linked to basically the liberalisation of markets everywhere, and that didn't end very well. We may indeed be on a new, it might be indeed be the collapse of neoliberalism, but unfortunately last time liberalism collapsed, it plunged the world into devastation through the rise of populism, through the rise of fascism. We're seeing the same forces happen again. This is scary times we're living in.
Yes, questions? Maybe we can have a couple of questions at one go, and then we'll have the judges so we can make best use of time.
Okay, so just now, because the question was about the conflict between new public management and social entrepreneurship movement. So right now, there's a new movement when it comes to public sector management. It's public value management and public value governance. I'm just interested in knowing your thoughts about whether or not this could be a new paradigm to resolve the dilemma between, the conflict caused by contracting out and social entrepreneurship. Because I've seen some governments are trying their best to improve their social service contracting practice, like creating new different sets of performance indicators, and try to encourage, social enterprise or NGOs to create different social values. So I'm just curious about hearing your thoughts.
Okay, other questions? Yes, please.
So, a question around who sets the research agenda. So, in some aspects, that pertains to the relationship between researchers and practitioners. But I also think it speaks to the relevancy and accuracy of research done around a field which is highly dynamic and quickly changing. So, there's not a specific question there, but what research should be being done, and to what degree should researchers be accountable to practitioners in determining the knowledge they're creating is actually accurate and relevant?
Okay, and the next question from Philo.
Hi, just want to ask about, I think when you had the first debate about the commonalities between the two sides, from a social entrepreneurship, from an approach perspective versus from a institutional or entity perspective. From a research perspective, are there, and given that you're all in the university education field, are there any research discussions along the lines of having an impact lens to career management with respect to the students that you teach? So to frame this, for example, when I graduated from business school almost 20 years ago, only less than 10% of the students have heard of or interested in social entrepreneurship. Nowadays, in terms of the business school clubs and associations, as I'm sure even in other masteral programs, social entrepreneurship, impact investing, in terms of popularity is number one. And I hear that this is actually consistent across the globe. So there's this theme. Maybe from a research perspective, there some discussions along those lines wherein how do you embed an impact lens to career management? And there are so many sub-threads along those lines. Thank you.
Okay, one more question, then we'll go for the judges. Yes, Professor Siu.
Right now, Hong Kong is under the research atmosphere is changing. We are now pushing hard to have research impact, and which right now in the research assessment exercise, we now not just place emphasis on what we call the A journals. We're also looking forward to have research impact on the community, on the society. And I know that the UK has already implemented this system quite a while. Then I would like to have some kind of insights from the panel. How could this impact on the UK academia? Because it is very important to the Hong Kong academia as well.
So, research impact, public value, and career management.
I'll defer to the Professor of Public Policy to answer that novice question in a minute. Just a couple of quick points about the other two questions. In terms of the careers issue, I don't think it's necessarily common across all British universities, but we certainly do focus heavily on this. So we have both a defined kind of impact track through our main course, which is an MBA program, and we have a bunch of co-curricular activities, and we have a careers conference for impact, and we have guest speakers and recruiters, because we have 340 MBAs, and this year 130 of them have identified as being in this impact group, so 1/3 of our MBAs. And so for them, the careers question is a real question. This isn't just something they want to do as a hobby, it's something they want to try and do as a career. So we've had to respond to that. And I'm not saying it's perfect, but we've had to develop quite a lot of wraparound. So I think it's an interesting point. Just briefly on the ref, if your question is purely about impact, then we are now more focused on that than we have ever been, because this cycle that concludes in 2020 requires us to submit as 25% of our submission evidence of our impact. So before, in previous rounds, it was a far smaller number, and the main number was about our research and its pure kind of quality, if you will. So the UK government's pushing us towards this agenda, and we're all now running around trying to desperately prove we've had some impact, because it's quite a rigorous process. You can't just say you've had impact, you need to have evidence of it. But this, I think, is is pushing academics increasingly to think about, can our work be translated into impact in different ways? Through BRICS, of course, the brilliant BRICS project being an example. And now over to the Professor of Public Policy for everything else.
Yeah, the impact agenda is great. Apart from, it causes a few problems. So it's not just at the ref side of things, but also on the grant giving side of things. They want you to demonstrate how you would have impact. And I think this is well-meaning. I think it's important that research should have impact, but it doesn't leave a lot of space for more critical research, more theoretical research. It's very impact-driven. And there's good and bad things about that. I won't say much more. Michael's our impact lead. What tends to happen in most universities is, I think in the business schools, you get the people like Alex who used to be on the margins and they dump everything impact and you're doing the social enterprise stuff. Now he's become mainstream and they're in trouble, or he's in trouble. But I suppose my own interest would be in the new public management and new public governance, and I think there's a lot written about this. I live in the UK, I live in Scotland actually, and we present ourselves as world leaders in the Scottish approach, co-produced approach to everything, and they're very, very, very good at talking about this approach. Doing it slightly different, so they've still got the old levers of new public management. You've got local authorities that have been run by Labour for quite a long, long time. They've got particular ways of doing things to people. They don't do things with people. And there's really interesting research in that area looking at how you transition from one thing to another, which I think is relevant to what Alex was saying earlier about moving from neoliberalism to a better world, or Michael's fascist world. We don't know which one yet. But yeah, Scotland's a great place to study fascism.
I'd like to pick up on the question about how do you make research relevant to practitioners and engaging with local practice. And so I sort of pointed to this idea of building epistemic communities at the end of my talk. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot. I teach at Yale, which is located in New Haven, Connecticut, which is a very poor city. And so we've been establishing at the university spaces where we can connect city practitioners and stakeholders with the academic community and create some jointly constructed projects. And so I've been teaching and doing some more work on urban poverty and economic development, and this has gotten me thinking about, along the lines of some of the things that Michael mentioned in terms of pulling down policy or pulling down models that have been piloted or that are out there as alternative modes of practice that are promising at the global or national level, and then pulling them down to that local context and implementing them in a kind of unique way. But one of the things that there's some interesting writing about and some energy around in the US is really sort of the opposite of some of the things we heard at the very beginning of the conference, where the comment was made, we need to move to action. Stop with all the talking, we need to move to action. In this space, there's been some real thought around taking the time to build these epistemic communities because we're such a divided society. And in the US, we've seen, of course, a long-standing racial divide, but an increasing economic divide that is located at the neighborhood level, where you have this segregation of the wealthy and a real disconnect between the rest of the population. And so there are all these really interesting experiments in doing that, in building those epistemic communities, doing things like citizen advisory boards or citizen juries, where you pick a representative sample of 50 citizens from the city, and you pick a problem like affordable housing, and you take a year to have them interview experts, bring in whoever they want to hear from around the country, and then build some kind of plan. But the real agenda is creating some shared sense of what the problem is, what are the possible solutions. And then over time, cities like Jacksonville, Florida have had 30 years of these citizen juries, and it's built an incredible regional capacity for taxing themselves or making some of those investments for the broader good. So I'm very interested in those kind of projects of not just identifying that model and trying to implement it, but understanding the kind of work that has to be done to create an environment where those kind of projects can be sustained and embraced by a very divided population.
Completely forgotten what the questions are. I was so engaged, but just in relation to impact, I guess because I come from social work and community development has been part of that paradigm, as with I have a global kind of engagement with development, but from a post-colonial perspective, I think really what I was thinking about was how like that is to a post-colonial approach, where the recognition that modernist paradigms for development have largely been about making people like us, you know, of really trying to create, turn people into a successful economic citizens, usually white. And in the Australian context, I don't know how many of you are aware of our highly marginalised Indigenous population. I guess what we see in our broad project in social work and community development is the biggest impact is opening up spaces for people to speak and to be heard, because policy has constantly recolonised those spaces and impose these sort of dominant expectations of transformation rather than recognising people's agency in how they identify themselves. And that's a kind of, you know, I won't go into kind of Spivak's theories of the subaltern, but I guess we have most of the research in the social work, social development field is all about impact. I mean, it's nothing but impact, and participation in that way that Kate just described is integral to that. But from a broader university perspective, to answer the other question, yes, we've just had a huge debate in Australia because the Minister for Education intervened and knocked back all these research projects because he didn't like the titles of the projects, and now they're creating new national interest KPIs for all sort of government-funded projects, and impact has always become, you know, a really large aspect of getting research funding and demonstrating your impact over time. So, but I don't think the public value question doesn't really fit in the current dominance of neoliberalism. They haven't. That hasn't been on the agenda. It may be theoretically interesting, but it's certainly not practiced at the moment.
Thanks very much. I'm going to try and answer the question at the back and Alex as well around impact. The thing about focusing concentration or an increasing concentration on impact is that it changes behaviours, and indeed any KPI changes behaviours. But unfortunately, what you're not capturing is the research that is most impactful. What you're capturing is those who are best at describing their research as impactful. Those things are not necessarily the same. And going to Alex's question earlier about who sets the agenda. Well, yes, epistemic communities do indeed set research agenda. Government sets research agenda. But if you introduce notions like doing impactful research or doing quality research, then doing the most interesting research or the most useful research is not necessarily the research that's going to be published in a 4-star journal at Academy of Management. It's going to be it's the research that's going to be most easily made to look excellent. Okay, that does not equate to excellent research. It equates to research which is being able to be dressed up to look like impactful research, to be made look as scientific, etc. as possible. Polishing turds, as Simon describes it. Yes, I'm the chief turd polisher in our office, and what essentially that means is that we have young researchers are great, but and they do wonderful work, and they're really committed to what they're doing. But then we need to think about, right, okay, where is this going to go? In which we need to put it in the highest ranking journal, because that's how our university, how our KPIs all work, etc. So basically what we have to do is polish that diamond into something that basically shines better than perhaps it really should shine, if you know what I mean. And that's what happens when you introduce KPIs into things like universities, etc., neoliberalization. And talking about, just a very final point there, we've spoken about the making, thinking about the economic, or judging the success of students, I suppose, and being successful economic agents or whatever, or how much money they earn, etc. In our subject, I chiefly think of myself as I teach people how to think. And frankly, I think we need far more people with critical thinking skills than MBAs, frankly.
Can I have Professor Kevin out to give some key observations?
Sure. Well, I think our discussion has been quite broad, and there's a lot of sociology or public policy kind of perspective here. So I think it may be difficult to address that question of practical, because I think maybe we need to bring back up some management cases, critical case studies, that kind of lessons for practitioners to pick up. And also I think our discussion haven't been able to bring in the local perspective, although all the speakers have mentioned the indigenous point of view are very important. And I do believe that as a person from Hong Kong, I think the development of social enterprises movement is quite different from other places. So in that sense, I think for local scholars who are interested in this area, I think maybe the local material could also be published in some of the journals, because we have a unique development. And another thing I want to address to Philo is that I think in the past few years, the interest in impact among students and scholars have increased a lot. Some of my colleagues, let's say in science and engineering, they're now more interested in commercialize the technology to open, for some social innovation, or even open some new social enterprises. Students are interested in taking some courses on social impact and impact investment. So I think so for Hong Kong's development in the past, say 20 years on social enterprises, we have seen some interesting changes in the society. Although Hong Kong is comparing to other cities, is an international financial center, and one interesting thing about Hong Kong is we are a deep believer in market. So I always said to people, in Hong Kong, if you tell people that you're trying to do a social enterprise or impact investment, some people may think that you are a businessman, but you are not a very good businessman, because you are trying to disguise yourself, right, from not doing good business. Or you may just be a person, if you are saying, or they may think that you are trying to solicit money from them for investment, but pretending that yourself you are doing a charity. So this is we have a strong kind of ideology, local ideology to overcome in order to develop social enterprises and impact investment in Hong Kong. So that could be quite unique area to address.
That's excellent. I mean, you have sounded out very well. I don't have much to add. I do agree. Context is king, and we can push the frontier, the knowledge, the journal, the publications, by understanding more of the context. But I do agree also, taking the angle of political economy, political science is really is going to enrich the field and going to push it forward, and linking it with other literature, like in community development and social work, etc., and also in health. And I think a lot of social enterprises are also working in the health sector, even though they are not actually opening up a clinic. Eventually, what a lot of social enterprises are doing is actually creating that well-being, which contributes to overall health. So I think these are a lot of these big topics, big areas that we've discussed about. Systemic change, also what one of the speakers presented about. Talking about not just at the micro or meso level, but looking at the macro level of the outcomes or the impact of the social entrepreneurship movement. That's pretty much it. We would like to thank a lot to all the great speakers here, and for all of you here who are here, starting from 9:30 a.m. in the morning. So it's been great to have you here. Before we leave, we have a couple of short announcements. One of them is from myself. We're going to have, I think you have seen this poster. We're going to have another talk from Professor Johanna Mayer and Christian Silos from Stanford PAX on the 10th of December, 2 weeks from now, in Hong Kong PolyU campus. Please do welcome and join us, and there is a registration with a link there. And there's another announcement from Tristan.
Thank you. So just very quickly, as part of the BRICS program, which is Building Research Innovation for Community Knowledge and Sustainability, we are conducting a social innovation and social entrepreneurship research and teaching landscape survey or study in Hong Kong. So I would encourage everybody in this room, please, to complete and contribute to our survey. You can get the QR code on your seat. We really think this would be a great way for you to contribute and to learn about how we can build these two fields in Hong Kong. And we think this is the first time this survey has been done. And we're supported by Yanto, Kevin, and Nora, and Alex in the design of this survey. So this will be really a flagship piece of research. So we really want to get and capture as much information as we can from what's going on between academics working in these two emerging fields. So please, can you all complete it and encourage your colleagues and friends to complete it as well. And the second thing is you should also have, well, there are two surveys to complete. One is from the British Council. We'd love to learn and find out what you thought about today's events and what we could do differently to potentially learn to do things differently in the future. And of course, there's also the Social Enterprise Summit one as well, but I should promote that since I'm promoting this one. But yeah, do complete the British Council one. That's available as an online survey, which we'll send to you as well. So, and also, please do, if we haven't got your contact information and you're happy for us to have it, please drop your business card with either me, with Margaret, put your hand up, or Chris over here before you leave. We'd love to stay in contact with you and to engage you with future BRICS events over the next year or so as well. That's my couple of announcements. Thank you.
So that's the end for today's session. We're hoping to do this again next year, hopefully a bigger scale and with a bigger impact. Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.